We begin with the Newman government's plan for mega asset sales to help dig Queensland out of debt. The centrepiece of this afternoon's state budget, the sell-off will raise more than $33 billion when combined with long-term leases. Private investment will also be allowed in power suppliers, but taxpayers will maintain 100% ownership. Furious unions say it's a sale by stealth. State political editor Cathy Border is at Parliament with all the key budget details. And Cathy, this is all about getting rid of our $80 billion debt.
Yes, Georgie, that has been the government's pitch all along. We were told that Ergon, Energex and Powerlink would not be sold. They won't be, but there is a sting in the tail that private investment by companies will be allowed. Unions say that combined with the other measures that have been announced, that's effectively a sale anyway, and that as a result we'll see higher power prices and even some job cuts. This has certainly been a long time coming. We've actually been waiting for it really since the Newman government was actually elected. The crunch time will be in the sales pitch up to the next election, especially for backbenchers like the LNP's Sean Choate, because he's already said that he's staunchly against any water or power sales.
Unions feared it'd be the sale of the century. Not so, says the architect and treasurer.
We're not going to go to a fire sale of assets.
The mixture of sales and leases will raise a massive $33.6 billion, with the bulk of it, $25 billion, paying off debt. Most of the remaining $8.6 billion will be spent on roads, rail infrastructure, schools, buses and trains, including $1 billion for the underground Bat Tunnel, linking Dutton Park to the inner city bypass. Powerlink, Energex and Ergon would remain 100% owned by taxpayers, but private companies would be allowed a share in income and costs. Ergon's retail arm would be sold off. Also up for grabs will be electricity generators Stanwell Corporation and CS Energy.
You'll be empowered to go out and find the best price you can for your power bill.
But for the unions, it's a sell-off by stealth.
It's deceitful. It's the government not being honest with Queenslanders. They are selling Ergon, Energex and Powerlink. Private equity is privatisation.
Business says the budget gets the balance right, but says there's not enough information about how the privatisation process will work.
Queensland businesses, particularly in regional Queensland at present, are fearful that prices will rise and services will deteriorate.
As expected, Gladstone and Townsville ports will be leased out for a minimum 45 years, as would the Mount Isa rail line.
We want to make sure that the users aren't ripped off.
But Sunwater's industrial pipeline supplying water to businesses like the mines and power stations would also be sold off.
To now divert that money into funding the infrastructure program for this government's re-election campaign is appalling.
This government is all about a plan that they've had from the start to sell assets, not a plan to create a stronger community in Queensland.
The for sale and lease signs only going up after the next election. The Treasurer says if the asset sell-off and leases don't happen, there'd be a huge hike in taxes. 30,000 more public service jobs would go to cut services, and the price of go-cards would skyrocket.
Now, the budget itself is certainly no frills, but the clear message is that if we don't vote for the LNP and endorse this plan, that we won't get a lot of those big infrastructure projects. For pensioners, they're still left in the dark and could be for months, especially with a lot of those concessional payments. Max Futcher has the details.
The Treasurer calls it his plan for a brighter future.
We are very excited by this budget.
But try telling that to seniors and pensioners.
They will go without to balance their budget.
Thanks to the federal government cancelling $54 million of funding, pensioner discounts will receive 15% less across the board. That will impact electricity rebates, council rates, water, natural gas and public transport fares, but it's unclear by how much.
These are people who are on fixed incomes, not like the highly paid politicians we have in this state.
The concessions will still be quite substantial. They just won't be as high as they would otherwise have been.
Health sees a 6% funding lift, with a large chunk of $13 billion going to the new Children's Hospital, the new Sunshine Coast University Hospital and IT upgrades. Big capital spend, but nurses ask, where are the extra staff?
That's what our members were hoping for, is to see more nurses, because they really are at the end of their tether in terms of the services they're delivering now.
Education funding is up 7% to nearly $12 billion, with $117 million towards new schools and $94 million to help the transition of grade 7 to secondary school.
Just over 1% increase to the operating budget for education is not going to be sufficient to accommodate delivery of education with the enrolment growth.
The other big ticket item, roads, gets $5.4 billion, $320 million of it for a second Toowoomba range crossing, while $768 million is for ongoing Bruce Highway upgrades. The government's commitment to the Carmody inquiry into child protection got $406 million over 5 years, which advocates hope will go directly to frontline services.
Those priorities include an investment in family support services, and that's where that money needs to go in the first instance.
The fight against alcohol-fuel violence gets $44.5 million, funding the establishment and policing of the so-called safe night out precincts. Low coal prices and a high Aussie dollar mean a blowout in the fiscal deficit to $2.25 billion, but the Treasurer is still confident of a surplus the following year.
We will be able to maintain that fiscal surplus for about 3 years.
Max Futcher, 10 Eyewitness News.
And joining us is the man of the moment, the Treasurer, Tim Nicholls. Good afternoon to you. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon, Cathy.
Let's start off with the pensioners. Why are they being left in the lurch, possibly for months, regarding those vital subsidies?
Sure, the federal government, of course, has cut the contribution they make to the concession scheme by 15%. This government's actually increasing the contribution we make by 9.9%, but we just can't absorb all of it. So pensioners and so on will still receive quite generous concessions. It won't be as much as we would have liked. And we're trying to make up the difference.
And you actively want them to target federal MPs if they're angry about this?
Very much so. Go and see your local federal MP. If the federal government changes their position, then that concession can be fully restored.
The Premier told us last year, and has again this year, that he was staunchly against the sales of Ergon, Energex and Powerlink. But this little measure that you've got in for private investment, did you have to talk him round to that one?
Well, what we're actually doing is keeping 100% ownership of the shares in Queensland government hands, and we're asking the private sector to help us meet the costs of growing the network, and in exchange for that, they'll share some of the income. So we are absolutely determined to keep that 100% share in our hands, but the private sector can help us and in exchange get a share of the profits.
Can you understand that in these budget times it will perhaps sit not well with taxpayers that you've still been able to find another $5 million to sell this asset plan to taxpayers?
Well, we've got no new taxes in this budget, we're not cutting services, and $5 million to tell people about the problem, the $80 billion worth of debt, and the solution we think is money well spent. It's less than half a day's interest on that $80 billion worth of debt. We've got to get it down if we want to invest in the vital infrastructure like schools and hospitals that the state's going to need.
Sales pitch begins tomorrow?
Sales pitch is already started, and that is, if you want to see something that has a strong plan for a brighter future, have a look at the Strong Choices website and tell us where you think the money should be spent.
At the end of your budget speech, there was a little moment with the microphone where you indicated you were looking forward to the night. Is it going to be a cigar night or a quiet night?
Oh, Cathy, we're still working hard for Queenslanders. I'll be doing that tonight and I'll be starting again tomorrow.
Thank you, Treasurer.
That's a pleasure.
The Treasurer, Tim Nicholls, joining us. Georgie.
Thank you, Cathy. Our State Political Editor, Cathy Border, with Treasurer Tim Nicholls at State Parliament.